I had a problem with anger. I knew I do. I might be, just happy-go-lucky now, and someone get me mad.
I remember him coming up to me in the kitchen. He was really upset, and he was crunching his fists and shaking. He said, "Dad, I need help."
Savona, New York, August 2nd, 1993. A quiet summer morning. In a town where children roamed freely and parents trusted their neighbors, a crime unfolded that would fracture that trust forever. On that day, 4-year-old Derek Robbie set off for summer camp alone. He never arrived. Hours later, his battered body was discovered in a wooded area just a short walk from his home. The brutality stunned even seasoned investigators. Derek had been strangled, beaten, and left in the dirt, his life cut short before it had truly begun. Police quickly realized they weren't looking for a stranger. Instead, their suspect was a local boy, 13-year-old Eric Smith, a child himself. Eric Smith was not the picture of a typical murderer. Freckle-faced, red-haired, and slight for his age, Smith had been a target of bullies for years. Classmates mocked his thick glasses, prominent ears, and awkward mannerisms. At home, he was described as quiet, sometimes withdrawn, but never violent. But on that summer morning, Smith made a choice that would haunt 2 families and an entire community for decades. The sequence of events was chilling in its simplicity. Smith encountered Derek Robbie walking to camp. He coaxed the younger child off the sidewalk and into a nearby patch of trees. There, he strangled Derek, struck him repeatedly with rocks, and left him where he fell. The motive, investigators would later say, was rooted not in any personal grudge against Derek, but in Smith's own pain. Years of humiliation and isolation, compounded by mental health struggles, had left him angry and desperate to exert control. That rage found a tragic outlet in Derek Robbie. Days later, the truth came out. Smith, unable to keep the secret, confessed to his mother what he had done. Soon after, he sat in a police interview room, recounting the details with unsettling clarity. To the authorities, his admission was both a breakthrough and a cause for deeper unease. Eric's manner, at times detached, even smiling, shocked everyone in the room. It was hard to reconcile the violence with the boy in front of them. The case made headlines across the nation. The crime's brutality, the age of the victim, and the youth of the perpetrator sparked fierce debate. Could a 13-year-old truly understand the consequences of such an act? Was Eric Smith a monster or a child in need of help? The public struggled to make sense of a tragedy that seemed to defy explanation. The trial began in 1994. Prosecutors painted Smith as remorseless, driven by rage and resentment. The defense focused on his history of being bullied, presenting him as a damaged child shaped by years of cruelty. Psychologists testified about Smith's emotional struggles and social isolation. But the facts remained. A 4-year-old was dead, and the person responsible was barely a teenager. The jury found Eric Smith guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 9 years to life in prison, the maximum allowed for a juvenile at the time. For Derek Robbie's family, there was no closure. For Smith, the cell door closed on his childhood. Smith spent nearly 3 decades behind bars. During that time, his life changed in ways few could have predicted. He pursued therapy and education, eventually earning a college degree while incarcerated. Prison records and the testimony of mental health professionals documented a transformation. Smith expressed genuine remorse, developed empathy, and sought to understand the horror he had inflicted. By his own account, he came to grasp the magnitude of his crime only after years of reflection and counseling. But Derek Robbie's family was never convinced. For them, the wound remained raw. Every time Smith came up for parole, and there were many attempts, they fought for him to remain behind bars. A child's life was taken, Derek's mother said in hearing after hearing. There can never be enough time served. The story didn't end with the sentence. Smith's case fueled national debate about how to treat juvenile offenders. Could someone so young, who committed such a heinous crime, ever be rehabilitated? Was redemption possible, or did some acts put a person beyond forgiveness? Experts and lawmakers cited his case in discussions of criminal justice reform, raising questions about the balance between punishment and the possibility of change. In February 2022, Eric Smith was granted parole. He walked out of prison after 28 years, having spent more time incarcerated than he had ever lived as a free boy. The decision drew immediate controversy. Derek Robbie's family and much of the Savona community opposed Smith's release. But the parole board cited his remorse, his rehabilitation, and the recommendations of mental health professionals who had evaluated him over the years. As of 2025, Eric Smith lives quietly in upstate New York. He keeps a low profile, his exact location undisclosed. He's forbidden from contacting the Robbie family. For some, his release is proof that people, even those who commit the unthinkable, can change. For others, it's a reminder that justice can never erase the past. What makes the case of Eric Smith so haunting is not only the horror of what happened in those woods, but the questions it leaves behind. Can a child who kills ever truly make amends? Is there a point where redemption is possible, or should some doors remain forever closed? For the people of Savona, and for all who followed the case, those questions remain unanswered.
A Norfolk teenager admitted to stabbing his own parents to death.
I don't know what happened myself. I'm sure he can't remember what happened. So we just ask God to pray for him. He is a smart young man. Yeah, he is smart in school.
Norfolk, Virginia, December 19, 2013. A quiet neighborhood, Christmas just days away. Inside a brick home on Balling Avenue, a tragedy unfolded that would devastate a family and leave a city grasping for answers. That morning, 16-year-old Vincent Parker carried out an act of violence that defied every expectation of his character, his upbringing, and his future. By the end of the day, both of his parents, Wayne and Carol Parker, would be dead, killed not by a stranger, but by their only son. To neighbors and friends, the Parkers seemed ordinary, perhaps even exemplary. Wayne and Carol were devoted parents, active in their church, known for their warmth and discipline. Vincent, their only child, was a quiet teenager who rarely drew attention. There were no warning signs of chaos at home, no calls to police, no stories of violence or neglect. If anything, discipline was strict, but by all accounts, fair. The Parkers believed in boundaries, confiscating electronics when grades slipped, grounding for disrespect. These were the sorts of punishments most parents considered routine. But inside Vincent, resentment was growing. In the days leading up to the murders, his parents had confiscated his iPod, a seemingly minor consequence for a minor infraction. Yet for Vincent, it felt like the latest in a string of unfair punishments. The anger simmered, then boiled over. What happened next stunned even veteran investigators. On December 19th, Vincent waited until his father Wayne returned home for lunch. Armed with pepper spray and a knife, he attacked his father in the upstairs bathroom. The violence was sudden and brutal. Wayne Parker, a man who had spent his life providing for his family, never had a chance. After the attack, Vincent left the house, but he returned later when his mother Carol arrived from work. He assaulted her in the hallway, striking her repeatedly and inflicting fatal injuries. The attack was not impulsive. Prosecutors would later reveal it was planned, the weapons prepared ahead of time. The level of rage displayed was shocking in its intensity and focus. When police arrived at the Parker residence, they found Vincent at the scene. He did not attempt to run. He made no effort to cover up the crime or hide what he had done. He confessed immediately, telling detectives that he had been angry over being disciplined, especially after his iPod was taken away. The confession was chilling in its clarity and calmness. There was no wild story, no attempt to blame anyone else. Just a young man, sitting quietly, admitting he had killed the only people who had ever truly cared for him. The news swept through Norfolk, leaving residents and family members in disbelief. How could something so ordinary, a household punishment, lead to such extraordinary violence? Extended family, church members, and teachers described the Parkers as loving but firm, never abusive or neglectful. Vincent's actions were met with universal shock and confusion. No one saw this coming, one relative told the court. They were good parents. He was a good kid. It doesn't make sense. Prosecutors charged Vincent Parker as an adult. In court, he pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder. The legal proceedings were brief, the evidence overwhelming. Even as details emerged about the planning and execution of the attacks, the question of motive remained elusive. Was it the pressure of adolescence, the isolation of being an only child, or something deeper, an inability to cope with boundaries and consequences? Psychologists evaluated Vincent, searching for signs of mental illness or untreated rage, but the findings were inconclusive. The only clear motive was resentment, a festering anger at parental discipline that, for reasons no one could fully explain, exploded into murder. The judge, acknowledging Vincent's youth, nevertheless handed down a severe sentence: 60 years in prison, with 20 years suspended. The effective 40-year sentence reflected the gravity of the crime, the planned nature, the brutality, and the utter loss suffered by the wider family and community. "There are no winners here," the judge remarked. 2 lives lost, a 3rd destroyed. A family erased in a single day. The tragedy left more questions than answers. Family members and friends gathered for the funerals, struggling to reconcile the reality of what had happened with their memories of the Parkers' kindness and faith. Interviews with relatives revealed a family that valued structure, respect, and open communication. They spoke of a teenager who never gave any indication that he was capable of such violence. Even now, years later, they remain bewildered. The discipline Vincent cited as motivation was described as routine, no more severe than what any responsible parent might use. In the end, no explanation seemed to suffice. As of 2025, Vincent Parker remains behind bars, serving his sentence in a Virginia correctional facility. He is in his late 20s now, a decade removed from the home where everything changed. There have been no appeals, no public statements. He has faded from the headlines, but for those who knew the family, the scars remain. What makes the case of Vincent Parker so haunting is not just the violence, but the ordinariness of its origins. A teenage grievance, a confiscated iPod, parental discipline that was meant to guide, not destroy. In the aftermath, a community is left to wonder, how could something so routine turn so tragic? For the Parkers, there is no answer, only the memory of what was lost.
Did you ever look up on a computer and do research on psychopaths?
Yeah, I looked up sociopath and psychopath because I always found it fascinating, and the more I've aged, the more I can relate, because I don't feel sympathy for other people. I want to kill people, but I don't want to want that.
Davis, California, April 14, 2013. A quiet neighborhood, known more for its university students and tree-lined streets than for violence. But on that Sunday, a crime unfolded inside a modest home that would shatter any sense of safety and haunt an entire city. In the early hours, 15-year-old Daniel Marsh slipped through an unlocked back door. His targets were not his peers, nor even strangers who had wronged him. Inside the house lived Claudia Maupin, age 76, and Oliver Chip Northup, age 87, a married couple well known for their kindness and involvement in the community. Marsh knew of them only as neighbors. That night, their home became the site of an act so brutal it stunned even veteran detectives. The attack was chilling in its randomness and violence. Marsh crept through the darkened house, armed with a hunting knife. He found the couple asleep in their bed and attacked them without warning. Over the next several minutes, he tortured both victims, inflicting dozens of wounds. The crime was not hurried or impulsive. Marsh took his time, exploring the boundaries of cruelty with a calculated detachment. By the time he left, Claudia and Oliver were dead, killed in a place they had always believed was safe. Investigators were at a loss for a motive. There was no robbery, no sign of a personal grudge. When Marsh was eventually apprehended, the truth proved more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. He told detectives he'd acted out of curiosity. He wanted to know what it felt like to kill. The confession was matter of fact, delivered with a composure that alarmed everyone in the room. Who was Daniel Marsh? To most, he was an ordinary high school sophomore, slender, soft-spoken, and often described as intelligent. But beneath the surface, Marsh had struggled with darkness for years. He'd suffered a serious brain injury as a child. In adolescence, he battled depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts. He was taking antidepressants, and his family had sought help from counselors and doctors. But despite interventions, Marsh's mental health continued to spiral. Friends recalled that he sometimes spoke about violence in abstract, disturbing ways, but no one imagined he could act on those thoughts. For law enforcement, the details Marsh shared during his confession were almost too much to process. He described the attack in clinical terms, showing no visible emotion. In video recordings played in court, Marsh calmly recounted how he entered the house, how he inflicted pain, and how he watched his victims die. Mental health experts who examined him were divided. Some believed his history of injury and medication played a role. Others pointed to classic signs of psychopathy, lack of empathy, emotional detachment, and a fascination with suffering. The community response was swift and visceral. The randomness of the crime, an elderly couple targeted for no reason in their own home, left residents terrified. For weeks, neighbors triple-locked their doors, looking for reassurance that Marsh's arrest would be the end of their fear. The trial only deepened the sense of unease. The details, too graphic for evening news, leaked into public awareness through court transcripts and true crime forums. During the proceedings, Marsh's own words became the prosecution's strongest evidence. He did not deny his guilt. He did not attempt to deflect blame. Instead, he seemed almost eager to recount what he'd done, as if the memory was something to be shared, not hidden. Psychiatrists and prosecutors both noted the same disturbing feature: Marsh's apparent lack of remorse. The verdict was swift. Daniel Marsh was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, with special circumstances for torture. The court sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, citing both the savagery of the crime and the lack of any indication that Marsh could ever safely rejoin society. But the story didn't end with the conviction. In 2021, Marsh's attorneys filed for early release under California's juvenile resentencing laws. The argument that as a teenager his brain was still developing and that rehabilitation should remain a possibility. The parole board disagreed. After reviewing his psychological evaluations and the details of his crimes, authorities determined that Marsh remained a threat, citing the lack of remorse and ongoing fascination with violence. As of August 2025, Daniel Marsh remains incarcerated, serving his sentence at a California state prison. He has become the subject of podcasts and documentaries, his case dissected by true crime enthusiasts and mental health professionals alike. Each attempt to explain his actions runs into the same barrier: the chilling sense that, for Marsh, the line between curiosity and cruelty was dangerously thin. What makes the case of Daniel Marsh so haunting is not just the horror of what he did, but the randomness of his choice and the emptiness behind his motive. 2 lives were ended by a neighbor's passing whim. For Davis, and for all who study this case, the question lingers. How do you protect the innocent when the danger comes not from hatred or greed, but from a curiosity that cannot feel? For Claudia Maupin and Oliver Northup, there is no answer, only the memory of a crime that should never have happened.
Philip Chisholm was just 14 years old when he was convicted of killing his math teacher, Colleen Ritzer. He's serving a 25-year sentence for murder, along with a 40-year...
Danvers, Massachusetts, October 22, 2013, a small town just north of Boston, known for its quiet neighborhoods and strong community ties. On an autumn afternoon, as classes let out at Danvers High School, a tragedy unfolded that would shake the community and spark a nationwide conversation about safety within the very walls meant to protect students and teachers alike. Colleen Ritzer was only 24 years old, a bright, caring math teacher, beloved by her students for her patience and dedication. She was known for going the extra mile, staying after school to tutor, offering encouragement to those who struggled. Colleagues described her as a mentor, a friend, and a natural educator. On that day, no one imagined she would become the victim of one of the most shocking school crimes in recent memory. Her killer was a student. 14-year-old Philip Chisholm had recently moved from Tennessee with his mother. The transition was difficult. Teachers noticed he was withdrawn, quiet, and often seemed lost. But there was nothing to suggest what was coming. Until that afternoon, when, in the quiet of a second-floor bathroom, Chisholm attacked Colleen Ritzer, ending her life in an act so brutal it would haunt the town for years to come. The violence was not random. Investigators discovered that Chisholm had planned the attack in advance. He arrived at school with a backpack containing gloves, a box cutter, and a change of clothes, items he would later use in carrying out his crime. Security cameras captured him following Ritzer into the restroom after class. What happened next was swift and merciless. After killing her, Chisholm concealed her body in a recycling bin, dragging it out of the school and into a nearby wooded area. He attempted to cover his tracks, but the evidence left behind told the story in chilling detail. The search for Colleen Ritzer began almost immediately. When she failed to return home, her family sounded the alarm. By nightfall, police had discovered her remains behind the school grounds. The community, once united in support of its teachers and students, was suddenly reeling from disbelief and grief. Philip Chisholm did not get far. He was found hours later, walking along Route 1 in a neighboring town. In his backpack, police discovered bloody clothes and Ritzer's credit cards. Physical evidence, DNA, fingerprints, and surveillance footage connected him irrefutably to the scene. In interviews, Chisholm said little, his demeanor calm, his responses minimal. The contrast between the boy in custody and the violence of his crime disturbed even veteran detectives. The investigation quickly uncovered the extent of Chisholm's planning. It was clear this was not an impulsive act. He had selected his victim, prepared materials, and carried out his attack with chilling deliberation. Prosecutors argued that the premeditation, the bringing of weapons, the selection of the location, the attempts to dispose of evidence, demonstrated a level of intent that could not be explained by teenage impulsiveness alone. As the case made its way through the courts, more details emerged. Chisholm's defense cited his difficulties adjusting to his new environment, hinting at underlying mental health concerns. In court, his behavior was often erratic. He sometimes appeared distracted, even confused, and at other times showed little emotion at all. Mental health professionals were brought in to evaluate his competency, but ultimately, the court found him fit to stand trial. The trial itself was marked by tension and sorrow. Ritzer's family filled the courtroom, seeking answers and justice for their lost daughter. The prosecution presented the facts. A dedicated teacher targeted and killed by a student she was trying to help. The defense acknowledged Chisholm's youth and his emotional struggles, but the facts were overwhelming. The verdict was swift. Philip Chisholm was convicted of first-degree murder, along with additional charges related to the attack and attempts to conceal the crime. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole when he turns 40. A sentence reflecting both the seriousness of his actions and his age at the time of the crime. But even in prison, Chisholm's troubling behavior continued. He attacked staff members while incarcerated, prompting further concerns about his mental state and risk to others. Mental health professionals continued to monitor him, but the pattern of violence did not end at sentencing. In February 2025, Chisholm's attempt to appeal his conviction and sentence was denied. The court found no grounds for reconsideration, upholding both the verdict and his punishment. Today, Philip Chisholm remains behind bars in Massachusetts, his case a stark reminder of the dangers that can sometimes lurk within even the safest-seeming communities. What makes the case of Philip Chisholm so haunting is not just the brutality of the crime, but the betrayal of trust at its core. A student, barely more than a child himself, destroyed the life of a teacher whose only goal was to help him succeed. For the people of Danvers, and for educators everywhere, the echoes of that day remain, a call to vigilance, and a reminder of the darkness that can sometimes lie just out of sight, even in places meant to nurture and protect.
Well, ever since I was young, I've never got on with my mum. I knew that she favoured my sister more than me. And even though she said that she didn't, I knew that she was lying.
Spalding, Lincolnshire, April 12, 2016, a small market town in eastern England, where quiet streets and close-knit families shaped everyday life. On this spring evening, two teenagers crossed a threshold from adolescence into infamy, committing an act so cold and calculated that it would shock the nation and leave a permanent scar on British legal history. The victims were Elizabeth Edwards and her youngest daughter, Katie. Both were found dead in their beds, the victims of a meticulously planned attack by people they had trusted most. The perpetrators? Elizabeth's own daughter, Kim Edwards, just 14 years old, and her boyfriend, Lucas Markham, 15. Overnight, their names became synonymous with one of Britain's youngest and most disturbing double murders. For investigators, the facts were almost too stark to process. Kim and Lucas entered the Edwards home late at night. Armed with kitchen knives, they moved quietly through the dark, carrying out a pact they had discussed for weeks. First, they entered Elizabeth's bedroom. As she slept, they stabbed her repeatedly. Then they turned to Katie, Kim's 13-year-old sister, whose only crime was being home that night. The attack was swift, silent, and devastating, but the aftermath was even more chilling. Kim and Lucas did not run. Instead, they spent the next 36 hours in the house with the bodies of their victims. They ate ice cream, watched films, including Twilight, the series that, by their own account, inspired their sense of romance and shared destiny. To the outside world, nothing seemed amiss. But inside those walls, two children sat calmly in the shadow of what they had done. What could drive two teenagers to commit such an act together? The motive, as pieced together by police and psychologists, was a complex web of resentment, fantasy, and shared obsession. Kim harbored deep anger towards her mother, Elizabeth, believing she was treated unfairly compared to her younger sister. Lucas, himself struggling with his own troubled background, became Kim's confidant and partner. Together they cultivated a world apart from reality, a place where, inspired by fantasy, they could justify the unthinkable. The plan was not impulsive. Text messages and interviews revealed that the pair had discussed the murder in detail. how, when, and what they would do after. They referred to it as the plan, a secret pact forged out of anger, alienation, and a misguided belief in their own love story. It was this level of premeditation that stunned investigators. The couple showed a detachment from the reality of their actions that went far beyond simple teenage rebellion. Their eventual discovery came not from escape, but from exposure. When Elizabeth failed to appear at work, colleagues grew concerned. Police arrived at the home to find Kim and Lucas still inside, calmly waiting. There had been no attempt to hide, no plan for what would come next. When questioned, Kim's lack of remorse was evident. "I felt nothing," she told officers, a phrase that would echo through every account of the case. Lucas, too, admitted to his role with a similar absence of emotion. The trial captivated and horrified the public. Never before had Britain seen such young defendants stand trial for a double murder. In court, details of their relationship emerged, a bond that experts described as folie à deux, or a shared psychosis. Mental health professionals testified that, together, Kim and Lucas reinforced each other's darkest thoughts, escalating fantasies into deadly reality. Their fascination with fictional love stories like Twilight became a disturbing lens through which they justified their actions, believing somehow that their bond made them untouchable. The sentences reflected the gravity of the crime and the age of the perpetrators. Both were given life sentences with a minimum term of 17.5 years, reduced slightly on appeal, but still some of the harshest terms ever given to teenagers in the UK. The court's decision acknowledged the premeditation, the brutality, and the absence of remorse that defined the case. But for the families of Elizabeth and Katie, the loss was immeasurable. A mother and daughter gone in a single night, their lives ended by those they loved. For the community of Spalding, the shock would linger for years. Schools, mental health professionals, and policymakers began asking hard questions about how fantasy, resentment, and isolation could turn into real-world violence. The case of Kim Edwards and Lucas Markham became a touchstone for debates on juvenile justice, mental health, and the influence of media. Experts warned of the dangers when vulnerable young people retreat into fantasy worlds, reinforcing each other's darkest impulses. The story also prompted a re-examination of how family dynamics, bullying, and untreated trauma can fester into something much more dangerous when left unchecked. As of 2025, Kim Edwards and Lucas Markham remain incarcerated, serving out the sentences imposed on them as children. Their case is now studied across the UK, a cautionary tale of what can happen when anger, fantasy, and opportunity collide behind closed doors. What makes the case of Kim Edwards and Lucas Markham so haunting is not just the violence, but the calm and calculated way it was carried out. Two children, bound by love and resentment, plotted and executed a crime that robbed a family and a town of its sense of safety. In the end, it is the ordinariness of their lives and the coldness of their actions that continue to trouble all who hear the story. Oxnard, California, February 12, 2008. A gray Tuesday morning at E.O. Green Junior High. Students filtered into class as usual, unaware that, in moments, their sense of safety and innocence would be shattered forever. In a matter of seconds, a tragedy unfolded that would haunt the community, ignite national debates about hate, identity, and violence, and change the conversation about school safety for years to come. Lawrence Larry King was just 15. Known for his expressive style and courage, Larry had recently begun to embrace his identity, sometimes wearing makeup, jewelry, and high-heeled boots to school. For some classmates, he was a target for taunts. For others, a symbol of authenticity and self-expression. Larry's openness set him apart, and tragically, put him in the crosshairs of a troubled classmate. Brandon McInerney was 14, just a year younger. Quiet, athletic, and withdrawn, Brandon came from a home marked by chaos. Reports from social workers and court records would later reveal a childhood shaped by instability, violence at home, exposure to racist and homophobic views, and little sense of security. By the winter of 2008, McInerney's world was one of simmering anger and confusion, much of it unspoken. The conflict between the two boys escalated over weeks. Larry, perhaps emboldened by new confidence, began making advances toward Brandon, notes, compliments, and, at times, public displays that some classmates found amusing, others awkward. For Brandon, the attention seemed to provoke something deeper than discomfort. Teachers noticed tension and tried to intervene, but no one foresaw what was coming. On that February morning, everything changed. The first period was underway when Brandon walked into the computer lab. He approached Larry from behind, drew a handgun from his backpack, and fired 2 shots at close range. The classroom erupted into chaos as teachers rushed students to safety. Larry King, mortally wounded, was rushed to the hospital. He was pronounced brain dead 2 days later. Brandon McInerney made no attempt to flee. He was detained by school staff and police within minutes. The murder weapon was recovered, and the facts of what happened were never in dispute. What followed was a long, painful investigation, one that revealed as much about the failures of the system as it did about the boys involved. Investigators quickly determined the attack was not random. It was motivated, they found, by deep-seated feelings about Larry's gender expression and sexuality. Prosecutors argued it was a hate crime, fueled by intolerance and a desire to silence someone who dared to be different. The defense, meanwhile, focused on Brandon's upbringing, the violence at home, exposure to hateful ideologies, and the lack of intervention by adults who might have helped him learn to manage anger or understand difference. The courtroom became a battleground. Advocates for LGBTQ+ rights demanded justice, calling Larry's death a clear case of a hate-fueled attack. Others argued that Brandon's age, background, and emotional immaturity should factor into how he was punished. The first trial ended in a hung jury, reflecting how difficult it was for the community and the country to agree on what justice looked like. The case forced a reckoning within the school and the wider community. Teachers and students struggled to process what had happened in their midst. Administrators reviewed policies, searching for ways to create safer, more inclusive environments. National media descended, asking why it took the death of a child to expose such deep divides. For Larry's friends and family, the loss was immeasurable. For Brandon's family, the shame and regret ran equally deep. Eventually, Brandon McInerney accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, voluntary manslaughter, and use of a firearm. He was sentenced to 21 years in prison, a term that reflected both the seriousness of his crime and the complexity of his circumstances. The hate crime enhancement was not applied, a decision that drew criticism from many advocates who felt the motivation was undeniable. As the years passed, the legacy of the case continued to reverberate. Oxnard's schools introduced new training on bullying and tolerance. National conversations about hate crimes against LGBTQ+ youth gained urgency, and both families, devastated in different ways, tried to piece together lives forever altered by a moment of violence. Brandon McInerney was released from prison around 2022, having served his sentence with credits for good behavior. His current whereabouts are unknown, his life now private, removed from the public eye. For some, his release is an opportunity for redemption. For others, it is a reminder of a wound that can never truly heal. What makes the case of Brandon McInerney so haunting is not only the senselessness of the act, but the questions it forces us to confront. How does hate take root in someone so young? Could this tragedy have been prevented if the warning signs had been taken seriously, or if schools and communities had done more to protect vulnerable students? For Oxnard, for the families, and for everyone who followed the case, these questions remain, echoes of a tragedy that revealed just how much work there is left to do. Farnborough, United Kingdom. June 7, 1992, a quiet town in Hampshire, early summer dusk. The kind of place where most parents never worry about letting their children out after school. But on this night, an act of violence would shatter that sense of security and change British criminal history forever. 18-year-old Katie Ratcliffe was just making her way home from a friend's house. She never made it. On a suburban footpath, she was ambushed by someone no one could have imagined, a 12-year-old girl acting entirely alone. Sharon Carr was, in almost every respect, still a child. But on that evening, armed with a kitchen knife, she attacked Katie without warning or provocation. In a frenzied assault, she stabbed her victim 32 times. The violence was shocking not just for its savagery, but for its randomness. There was no connection between Carr and Katie Ratcliffe. No history, no grudge, no reason. Just an attack, brutal and deliberate, that left detectives searching for answers in the dark. The initial investigation yielded few clues. Katie's murder left the Farnborough community reeling, but with no witnesses or immediate suspects, police struggled to make progress. The case went cold. In the meantime, Sharon Carr returned to her troubled life, a childhood marked by instability and violence. Carr's home was a place of chaos, ruled by a violent father figure where fear and aggression had become routine. But even among the broken homes of the area, Sharon Carr stood out. Teachers and social workers noted her fascination with violence and death, and an unsettling sense of detachment from the world around her. Over the next 2 years, Carr's behavior only grew more concerning. She began keeping a diary, pages filled not with the worries or dreams of a young girl, but with graphic, detailed accounts of murder. She wrote about the pleasure she took in killing, boasting about the details of Katie's final moments. The entries were chilling in their pride and in the total absence of regret. For Carr, the crime was not a source of guilt, but of triumph. Sharon Carr might never have been caught, were it not for her own actions. In 1994, now aged 14, she launched another violent attack, this time on a fellow student at her school. The assault was interrupted, and Carr was arrested. In custody, her disturbing writings were discovered, and investigators quickly connected the details to the unsolved Ratcliffe case. Carr confessed. In police interviews, she described the attack on Katie in the same cold, matter-of-fact tone as her diary. She seemed almost proud. The trial that followed gripped the nation. Carr was charged with murder, making her Britain's youngest female killer ever tried and convicted in a court of law. The facts were horrifying. A child, driven not by anger or desperation, but by curiosity and a chilling desire for violence. Psychiatrists who examined Carr found a profound lack of empathy. They noted her obsession with death, her inability to understand the value of human life, and her ongoing fantasies about violence. Carr's age, background, and mental health made her case uniquely complex and uniquely frightening. The court found Sharon Carr guilty of murder. She was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 14 years before parole could even be considered. For many, the punishment was both inevitable and deeply troubling. A society forced to confront the reality that children are sometimes capable of unthinkable acts. But the story did not end at sentencing. Carr's behavior inside prison continued to concern authorities. She attacked other inmates, demonstrated violent outbursts, and showed little sign of remorse or rehabilitation. Experts continued to monitor her, but each review painted the same picture: a young woman still fascinated by violence, still disconnected from the gravity of her actions. Her attempts for early release were met with unanimous opposition. In 2023, more than 3 decades after the murder, Carr's bid for parole was denied. Authorities determined that she continued to pose a serious risk to public safety. She had spent nearly her entire life behind bars, a child who had become a criminal before she had even reached her teens, and an adult who had never really left the system. As of 2025, Sharon Carr remains incarcerated in the UK, serving her life sentence. Her case is studied in law schools and criminology courses, a chilling reminder that the capacity for violence can sometimes emerge where it's least expected. For the family of Katie Ratcliffe, the pain never truly faded. The loss of their daughter was made more unfathomable by the age and nature of her killer. What makes the case of Sharon Carr so haunting is not only the brutality of her actions, but the questions they raise about childhood, innocence, and evil. How does someone so young develop a capacity for such violence? And if a child can commit such acts, what does that mean for justice, for rehabilitation, and for the hope of change? For Farnborough and for Britain, the story of Sharon Carr is one that will never be forgotten. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the darkest criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon for more shocking cases. Allentown, Pennsylvania, March 2015. A suburban neighborhood at the edge of spring, ordinary on the surface but hiding the fault lines of a family about to be torn apart. That month, the murder of Cheryl Silvonek, a devoted mother, would lay bare the dangerous power of manipulation, teenage rebellion, and the kind of toxic love that turns deadly. Jamie Silvonek was just 14 years old, an honor roll student, bright, expressive, and, by all accounts, eager to please. But in the months leading up to the crime, Jamie's world shifted. She became involved with Caleb Barnes, a 20-year-old Army specialist who quickly became the center of her universe. The relationship set off alarm bells for those who knew Jamie best, especially her mother. The age gap, the intensity, the secrecy, Cheryl Silvonek saw it all as a threat to her daughter's safety. But Jamie, besotted and convinced she had found true love, saw only an obstacle. The conflict escalated quickly. Cheryl voiced her concerns, sometimes forcefully. She read Jamie's texts, questioned her about her whereabouts, and set firm boundaries, classic signs of a parent desperate to protect her child. But for Jamie and Caleb, Cheryl's vigilance became fuel for resentment. Their messages, later recovered by police, showed a growing obsession with removing anyone who stood in the way of their relationship. On March 13, 2015, the conspiracy became reality. Jamie invited her mother to join her and Caleb for what Cheryl believed would be a rare, pleasant outing, a concert, a chance for reconciliation, a night to reconnect. But it was a trap. On the drive home, as the car sat parked on a secluded road, Barnes attacked Cheryl. The violence was brutal, deliberate, and final. Jamie, present at the scene, did nothing to stop it. The plan, as it would later become clear, had been hatched in secret, but executed in plain sight. Investigators began piecing together the truth within hours. The crime scene told its own story. Cheryl's body was found in the trunk of her own car, hastily covered, as if concealment could somehow erase what had happened. The couple's alibi unraveled almost immediately. Police obtained text messages between Jamie and Caleb, long, detailed chains that chronicled their planning and intent. There was talk of methods, timing, and the future they imagined once Cheryl was gone. The digital trail was unmistakable. The motive was clear. Jamie and Caleb believed that only through Cheryl's removal could they remain together, free of scrutiny or consequence. For prosecutors, the evidence of premeditation was overwhelming. They argued that Jamie, despite her age, had played an active and knowing role in the conspiracy. Defense attorneys, meanwhile, pointed to the vast difference in age and experience between Jamie and Caleb, suggesting she had been groomed, manipulated, and coerced into a crime she could not fully comprehend. The trial revealed the toxic dynamic at the heart of the case. Experts in adolescent psychology testified about Jamie's vulnerability, the susceptibility of teenagers to influence by older, dominant partners, and the way fantasy and reality can blur for those caught in obsessive relationships. But the facts remained. Jamie had plotted her mother's death, had taken steps to enable the crime, and had not tried to stop it. The verdict was unambiguous. Jamie Silvonek was tried as an adult and pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. She received a sentence of 35 years to life, an extraordinary term for someone so young, but one the court deemed appropriate given the gravity of her actions. Caleb Barnes was sentenced to life without parole. Both sentences sent a clear message about accountability, regardless of age or circumstance. But the story did not end in the courtroom. Jamie's legal team launched a series of appeals, arguing that her immaturity and Caleb's manipulative influence had not been properly weighed. They pointed to Jamie's own accounts of coercion, her mental state, and the enduring impact of an older partner's control. Family members, including Jamie's father, joined the call for reconsideration, urging authorities to see her as a victim as well as a perpetrator. But in 2023, a Pennsylvania court denied her bid for a new trial, citing the evidence of careful planning and willful participation. As of September 2025, Jamie Silvonek remains incarcerated at Muncie State Prison. Her story, and that of her mother, is still not finished. Jamie is now seeking commutation of her sentence, supported by family who believe she was too young, too vulnerable, and too manipulated to be held to the same standard as an adult killer. The case continues to raise difficult questions about justice, punishment, and the power of unhealthy relationships to warp the minds and lives of the young. What makes the case of Jamie Silvonek so haunting is not just the betrayal at its core, but the warning it offers about the dangers that can emerge when obsession, manipulation, and adolescent insecurity collide. For Cheryl Silvonek, the desire to protect her daughter proved fatal. For Jamie, the line between victim and perpetrator remains forever blurred, a reminder that in the darkest crimes, innocence and guilt are sometimes more entangled than anyone wants to believe.